What if you didn't need a big, perfectly defined goal to grow next year? What if growth could start with something simple? Something you can do in the margins of your day. If goal setting feels overwhelming, exhausting, or just not realistic for this season of life, this episode is for you. Because today we're talking about one of my favorite low pressure ways to grow, reading. And more specifically, my top 10 books of 2025. Welcome to More Than a Milspouse, the podcast for military spouses who want to live with more meaning and less overwhelm. I'm your host, Christine, seasoned military spouse, mom of 3, life coach, and your guide to intentionally designing a life you're excited about as a military spouse. I'm here to help you get the clarity you need so you can get unstuck and unlock your purpose and potential. Because you, my friend, are more than a milspouse. You have something valuable to offer. And when you pursue the things that light your heart on fire, you trade frustration for fulfillment and isolation for a life of impact. It's time to discover who you are meant to be, because together we can change the world. Welcome back to More Than a Milspouse. I'm Christine, and I'm so glad you're here. This is one of my favorite traditions of the entire year. Years ago, I started blogging my top 10 books of the year. I wanted a way to look back at everything that I had read the previous year and share what my favorite books from the year were. Then when I started the podcast, I brought this tradition with me. And every year since launching the podcast almost 5 years ago, I have released a top 10 list of the books that I read the previous year. So this is the 2025 version. And what I really want you to take from today's episode is this: there is always a way to grow, no matter how unpredictable life feels. And if traditional goals don't work for you, a reading goal might be a much more accessible place to start. So let's unpack this idea of a reading goal, and then we'll get into what books I recommend that I read this year. So for me, reading was not always a habit of mine. There were many years, especially before having kids and when my kids were babies, when I barely read at all. I was exhausted, and I really hadn't gotten back into reading, even though I loved it as a kid. I remember as a mom with young kids thinking, what are hobbies anyway? Who has time for hobbies? But I was feeling like I was doing all these things for everybody else, and I really didn't have anything for me. So I set a very simple goal to try to read more. And it began with the idea that I'm just going to read more, and then it developed into I'm going to read 1 book a month. And then it kept growing from there. It became 2 books a month. And now it's at the point where I try to read 1 book a week. And I have a secondary goal of trying to make almost half of those books be a nonfiction or memoir book. Now, full transparency, at this point, that's just kind of my general guideline. I haven't perfectly hit that goal the last couple of years. And part of that is because I've been writing more. And if you're a writer, you know, reading and writing tend to pull from that same creative well. And this year, my book took the priority. So the more that I write, the less that I actually read, because I'm spending more of that free time writing. So as I am recording this episode, I am just short of my total goal. I think I'll get there. I'm only like 3 books short for the year, and I have hit my nonfiction and memoir goal for the year. So it's been good. I'm really proud of what I've learned since making reading a goal in my life every year. Now, this is something that is flexible and can evolve with every season. So if you have a lot going on, then you can set a much smaller reading goal. If you have not as much going on, you can set a bigger reading goal. It can totally flex with whatever works for you. But I think setting a reading goal is an easy way to do something for yourself, because there are all types of books. Whatever your interests are, you can probably find a book that works for you. And if you're like, I'm not a reader, you don't have to read the book, right? You can do a digital version, you can do an audiobook version. There are different options. And for me, I like an assortment of all of the above. I really prefer audiobooks for fiction and memoir. I love it for memoir because usually the author is the one that reads the audiobook, so you get to hear it directly in their tone of voice. And I like audiobooks because you can listen while you're doing other things, while you're driving, while you're folding laundry, while you're doing dishes. All of the things that I feel like I can have something to listen to while I'm doing something that needs to get done. For nonfiction, I prefer digital books because I want to be able to look at the page when I'm reading. I want to be able to slow down, revisit ideas, highlight certain passages, and having my phone or a tablet is something that I usually have with me, so I can do it in small increments. Now, physical books is something that I still want to do more of, but I'm not there in this season. I really struggle to carve out time to sit down with a physical book and read it for a while. So that's the one I struggle with the most. We have lots of physical books in our house, but eventually my goal is to read more physical books. But like I said, there are so many different formats, so many different genres, so many different things that reading can be. So I just want to say there are so many entry points into this. And if you haven't tried reading, I highly recommend it. So let's talk about this year's top 10. And honestly, it was harder to create, not because I had too many books that I love this year, but because I read a lot of books that were just fine. And some years that happens. Some years I'm like, how do I narrow this down to 10 because I had so many books that I loved this year? That was not where I was at this year. But I do want to share what books stood out to me this year, the ones that either shifted my thinking or stayed with me for a while or met me where I was. Now, I've divided this list into nonfiction, fiction, and memoir. If you have listened to past episodes of my top 10 books of the year, you know that historical fiction is one of my favorite genres. Speaking of my past year's reviews, I will link those in the show notes of this episode. So if you're curious, other books that I have really enjoyed and really recommend, that's a good way to find more books to add to your reading list. But here's what made this year's top 10. Let's start with nonfiction. Tiny Habits by B.J. Fogg. Now, I have read Atomic Habits. I've read The Power of Habit. All of those are good habit books, but this is officially my new favorite book on habits. And B.J. Fogg breaks habit formation down into very simple and easy to follow formulas. He talks about the ABCs of habit formation. He has a whole matrix for how you decide which habits you should start with and what your goals are. This book is practical, empowering, and especially helpful if you've ever felt like you just can't stick with anything. This book deeply influenced how I think about change and how I coach it. So that was one of the big winners of the year. Then when we talk about nonfiction books, the second one on my list is Original Sin by Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson. This one is fascinating. It's a behind-the-scenes look at the final years of the Biden presidency and the cost of silence inside leadership systems. And it explores how loyalty, fear, and image protection can keep people from telling the truth. Even if you are not a political person, it's a fascinating look at power dynamics and once people are in power, what they are willing to do to stay in power. It looks at leadership, accountability, and the consequences of living in an echo chamber. So I found it a fascinating read. The third book to make my top 10 list this year is The Anatomy of Soul by Kurt Thompson. And this book is a very niche book. It came recommended to me from a friend, but it really sits at this intersection of neuroscience, faith, and emotional healing. If you are someone who nerds out on the science of our emotions and brain development, then you're going to love this book. But it really explores how our brains are shaped by relationships and how healing happens in safe, attuned connection. And this book really reinforced so much of what I've come to understand about identity, about belonging, and about transformation. If you're interested in nervous system work, spiritual formation, then this read is really worth your time. In that same vein of spiritual formation, the number 4 on my list this year is Practicing the Way by John Mark Comer. And this book, I read his first book, which is also incredible, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. But this one is really about the practice of formation and understanding that whether we realize it or not, we're all being formed by something. And so once we choose to become aware of what's forming us, then we can begin to change that and decide what we want to form us. In particular, it looks at spiritual formation and becoming like Jesus. How do we be with him, become like him, and do as he did? What does that practically look like in the way that we interact with the world around us, in the way that we practice spiritual disciplines? It's a really important read to say, this is not just something I believe, but I have to embody and live it out. So how do we do that well? Whether you are a Christian or you are just interested in spirituality, this is a really great read for anyone who wants to explore how their values and beliefs actually shape the way they live. Number 5 on the list is a memoir. It was Jen Hatmaker's new memoir called Awake, which really dives into her divorce, her religious deconstruction, and how she has rebuilt her life. Now, you may have no clue who Jen Hatmaker is, or you may be really familiar, but I have been following her journey for like the last decade, basically. And so this is a fascinating memoir, not just because of the subject matter, but because of how it's written, where she jumps back and forth in time. And this doesn't happen a lot with memoirs, but it was one of those books where it was actually hard to put down. I wanted to keep reading. I wanted to know what happened next. I wanted to know what she was thinking, what she was going through. And yeah, it's just a really well-written book that I really enjoyed. Now, I actually did not follow my own rule with this one because I was so interested in it. Like, I was put both the audiobook and the Kindle version on hold at the library, and the Kindle version came up first. So that's what I read. But I did hear that with the audiobook, she has a lot of phone calls, voice memos, emails that she references in the book. And if you listen to the audio version, she actually got each person that wrote or said that thing to record themselves for the book. So I think the audio book version would be fascinating as well. All right, moving on to number 6, let's get into fiction. Now, this first fiction, I kind of say it's part historical fiction, part memoir. It is The Magnificent Lives of Marjorie Post by Alison Pataki. It is a fascinating look at the life of Marjorie Merriweather Post, who is one of the wealthiest and most influential women of the 20th century. It's beautifully written, and it really explores a lot of these themes of ambition, feminism, identity, and what it looks like to build a life of significance as a woman, especially in a time where that was not as common. And it's just one of those books, like, I recommend everybody read that one. The second fiction book on my list, number 7, Did You Hear About Kitty Carr by Crystal Smith Paul. Now, this is one of those books that kind of jumps back and forth in timelines, and the present day timeline, I think, was not quite as well written as the timeline that took place in the past. But it is a really fascinating read. It gives you lots to think about, to chew on. It weaves together Hollywood, race, motherhood, legacy. It's about the stories we tell and the ones we hide. And it was one of my favorite fiction reads this year. The next one on my list is The Lion Women of Tehran by Marjan Kamali. The story follows these two girls who grew up together in Tehran, Iran, during a time of significant social and political change. But at the heart, the novel is about female friendship, how deeply formative early relationships can be, and how betrayal, separation, and silence can echo across decades. So that was a really fascinating read. And then the last fiction book on my list is The Last Thing He Told Me by Laura Dave. This was a book that Apple actually turned into a miniseries this year. I have mixed feelings about this book because it was one of those books that it kept me reading. It kept me interested. It was suspenseful. It was fast-paced. It was really interesting, but it had some plot holes in it. So I was like, I loved it because it kept me engaged all the way through. It was a great, easy listen, but it wasn't like the strongest story. And I was hoping, because it was coming out with this mini series, I'm like, maybe they'll fix the plot holes, but they really didn't. But if you're looking for an engaging, interesting read or listen, that was a good one. The Last Thing He Told Me by Laura Dave. And then we get to the fact that I needed 10, not 9 books for my top 10. And so I was like, well, once you go through like the top tier books I read, then you kind of have this secondary section of books that I read. And how do you choose which one to go on the top 10 list? Now, I say that because, there are other books I read that were really good this year, but I didn't finish them. And so it can only go on my list. This is my own personal rule, but it only goes on my list if I finish the book. So I'm still working my way through some books that I really enjoyed this year. But this was one book that I finished, and I decided it's going to make this list because this is a podcast for military spouses, and I found this one fascinating because of its relevance. And it is Becoming the Pastor's Wife by Beth Allison Barr. Now, I read her first book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, which was also fascinating. So I really wanted to read this one. It's a very niche topic, but the entire premise of the book is how the role of the pastor's wife, especially in the evangelical church, has become an unofficial and often unpaid pathway to ministry for women. And what struck me the most about this book was how closely this mirrors expectations placed on military spouses. The 2-for-1 model she discusses is something that Corey Weathers addressed in Military Culture Shift, which I talked about, I think, last year on the podcast. And it's something that Jen Barnhill explores in her new book, The Military Stories You've Been Told and the Ones You Need to Hear, which I'm currently working through. Speaking of that book, I will link the episode I did with Jen earlier this year in the show notes. So that rounds out my top 10 books for 2025. It was a little bit all over the place when it comes to topics, but I hope you find something in the list that resonates with you, that speaks to you, or that at least interests you. Or I will have all the links from my top 10 from past years that you can go back and listen to those and see what books from those you want to add to your list in 2026. So yeah, I read some really excellent books this year. I also read some that didn't live up to the hype. Like, I waited over a year on Libby to read The Housemaid, and honestly, it was just okay. But reading still matters. Even for me, even in a year where writing took center stage. But here's what I hope that you take away from this episode. Reading is simple. It's an accessible way to invest in yourself, whether you're interested in self-care, whether you're interested in growth, whether you just want something as an entertainment, as a distraction from the craziness of life. Just find something that you can do for yourself and maybe consider setting a reading goal for 2026. Start small, choose something doable, and go from there. As we close out 2025, I would love to hear from you. What were your favorite books this year? What books did you read that didn't quite live up to the hype? Send me a message on Instagram or come join the discussion inside our More Than Mill Spouse Facebook community. I hope that however you choose to end this year, you take a moment to pause, to breathe, and to remember that 2026 is a new year full of new possibilities. May you end this year with a sense of hope, joy, and peace. And may next year be a year where you live filled, fueled, and full of joy. Hey, Amazing Mill Spouse, before you go, I want you to know that I love hearing from you. The More Than a Mill Spouse community exists to help you thrive as a military spouse. Figure out what lights your heart on fire and empower you to live with purpose and impact. You can have an incredible impact simply by heading over to iTunes to subscribe and leave a review. But your impact doesn't stop there. You can empower those around you simply by sharing an episode with a friend or neighbor, someone who needs a little encouragement in this military life. And if this episode was meaningful to you, spread the love by taking a screenshot of this episode and tagging me on Instagram so we can continue to reach more people, change more lives, and shift the way that military spouses look at life. Because we are better together, and together we can change the world. Let's do it.